당저 지게 동아세야나 디기두비하기 dondalang 저기 디기다 탑람로디 나도 심주식으로 제주로서 마선디 파지시 다지 지구로 당저 대사당저 디기두비하다 동아요야기 탑람들이야 치 뭐벌라 때네 아니 디기두 두고 디기 용고래 안 동아 용고레스 안디나신 또 안나셈나 때네 아니 디기 용고래 두고래 동아 용고레스 자디니 자 당한 저기 아주 대심주셔야지 나셈나 때네 디기 줍다다 동아 세다 동아요야 규가라가를 때네 용고래 아니 셈간에 제발 유나 될 때네 동아용고 셈간에 질 때네 안데어 두고래스 아니 제사 동아요야 규셈디 안 매바간에 쓰고래스 동아 디기 두비에게 셈디 야게 공표간에 땅고 그래 사실 다디 거는 좀 심주라 지거로
Good evening. So we, as beings, we all the same in wanting happiness and wanting to be freed from suffering and problems. And in general, there are two paths or two techniques that one can engage in order to achieve happiness and avoid problems. So the first is the one that we know best from society, and that is through material possessions, material objects. That through the accumulation and experience of particular material objects, we can experience happiness, as well as utilize the material world so as to overcome problems and difficulties. The second technique is internal rather than external. And the internal technique involves becoming aware of our inner workings, seeing which ways of thinking lead to happiness, which ways of thinking cause suffering and pain. As we come to recognize those, naturally we'll be inclined to seek out the causes that lead to happiness and the causes that lead to mental pain and anguish. And then we'll look for the techniques by which we can strengthen mental happiness, as well as the techniques to eradicate all forms of mental pain and suffering.
셈나야 다 삼루토네 안에 디기요야기 동아요야디게 삼루간에 간지 코나네 삼루 텔레텐 동아용고레 라면도 다 삼루디 되차 공조 나자 마리바 차도 셈데솔레테네 안에 데소 셈데솔레테네 다 나츠길라 라신이가라 동아요야기 셈데 데솔레테네 용고 데솔레테네 용고 진짜 동아요야기 규 셈미토네 셰바네 데솔레스 지산 대소를 때네 저기라 안에 동아용고라 장ले 동아 샹라 강아 라신이가라 강아 동아디 안에 대소를 셈 대소를 때네 용고래 제려와 나는 디기 용어야 돼 셈가를 때네 용고래라네 샹레 제외 삼바다 아니 잠바다 안지 무이니수 최 저게 간지나 디 무이니수 지다와 신도 하고 흥게 네 동반이 또 비게 셰랍세야다 어디서 아니 진비냐면 수제냐래 쇠바샤다 준주에서다 심대설을 때네 안에 가지려야 라신이가래 디기용하기 디용하디 안에 강아세야다 디기용하데 심대설을 때네 용고래세 제가 지사다 나 동아용하기 규디 되자 공도가야 말이봐 안 차도 심대설 동아용하기 규 다 잠바다 제와 니제세야다 안에 지금 파신 두기 냠내세야다 안에 지금 동반이 또 셰랍세야다 대수 장슈 셈세야다 대소를 때네 셈 대소를 때네 마주래 디기 두고 그래서 디기 라신이가 디기 두고 그래서 지나데 셈딜라 동아요야기 규다 디기 두야기 규셈 니디샤 다 지나다가 중이디 딩이데 가라 고고래서네 마주래 디기 고고인데 디기요야기 규삼로도 마주길라 고고래 당 마주 동아 먹어와 인자 동아요야기 규 삼로 셈디게 바 매봐서 고고래서 마주 디고다 디기 시고로 봐
Through the many teachings you've received, as well as your own reflection, you will have confidence in many of the causes that lead to suffering, namely the afflicted minds. You'll have confidence that attachment leads to pain, anger leads to pain, as does ignorance, pride, jealousy, and the other afflictions. These are the causes that bring about suffering, not just for ourselves, but through our acting under their influence, our expression under the influence of these minds, we bring pain and misery into the lives of those around us. So, but also, you'll have confidence in having recognized well the causes that lead to happiness, in particular the virtuous ways of thinking, such as love and compassion, and acting in accordance with reality, as well as the 6 minds which are grouped together in the 6 perfections of generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joy, perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. So we have knowledge over what are the causes that lead to our suffering, as well as through expressing, through acting under the control of those afflictions, bring suffering to others, as well as similarly the virtuous minds that lead to our own happiness, and through their expression we can bring happiness to others, or at the least alleviate their pain. So this is something that we've already come to recognize.
So the Tsuyang can ligre sit down Zugi, Chizang Sangi, Nava Sangi Bigi, Ganisna Duji, Ganisna, good and Jen, Gilatini, Kigurmado, good and Jen, Shanla Madoba, Yawakino Yomares, Chedan, good and Jen, Shanla, Dune, Kigores, Mobo, Duji, Ganisna. The names are that Dua Condron, Aja, said down, Chado, Sibe, some no digi in there, that good and Jen, Gilatini, Kigores. Then Jen da anzugi dwecha jen jen kisage yu mi ba da de ne ke net konro ki na de ne wa de desugi ina zawi gyu zawa tusa zawi gyu di karcha gri lamna dasen marik ba se de anzugi denzen marik ba se de le de ne ki go re se anzugi da denzen marik ba se de ki go re chesan de denzen marik ba se de kanach re se ne da anzulia yu de kala ya ma de ko rang ngwe ne le pa sha ba la ma de rang ngwe ne drup du gen zimba de la denzen marik ba la go re chesan de anzugi nyom mo ba ki ge zawi gyu di de la de li go re 지산 디엘에 되는 자다디 먼저기 매바스 지 간이스도 심주시야 제바체야다 안디 안 제바체네 디모 하고야 디 매바스야 소상 간이 지고래 세디 나디 거시 안 심주 시거로 봐
We are all here because we want to only experience happiness and be freed from pain. And through the teachings you've already received and your reflections, you've come to recognize the causes that lead to suffering and those that lead to happiness. Those causes that lead to suffering, we are looking at these because, in the context of our text, these causes are important to identify because suffering is unwanted. We want to be freed of suffering. When we recognize that suffering comes about because of our own afflicted minds, we will ask ourselves, how do these afflictions come about? Do they come about causelessly? Are they, in other words, are they independent? Or are they dependent on, for example, causes? We've recognized that the afflictions, they don't arise without cause. So they cannot be independent. Rather, they arise independent on causes. So if you think of anger, for example, and you think of a recent illustration where you were angry or annoyed or frustrated, there may well have been an external event, maybe just some pressure that one was under, very busy, or something someone said or did. But then in addition to that, there were further causes, such as having the seeds for afflictions, the seeds of anger, and then it arose, as well as companion afflictions. And all of these internal causes have as their root ignorance. It's from the ignorance of self-grasping, grasping at the self as existing by way of its own essence, that we have the thought of mine. And from this, afflictions such as anger follow. So when we recognize this sequence, we see that suffering comes about in dependence on causes. The afflictions, too, come about in dependence on causes. And then what is that root cause? The ignorance of self-grasping, which we come to identify is a consciousness that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears, as being independent, or as existing by way of its own essence. And as that consciousness that is grasping at the self in this way is grasping at the self in a wrong way, it is a wrong consciousness, hence an ignorance. So this sequence we need to come to recognize. And it's through recognizing this we understand that being a sequence, it comes about dependently. There's no stage here that is independent. The stages are all dependent. And through recognizing this well, we can see that should we break this chain of dependency, the result will not follow. So that is why we are looking at this topic.
nga se da samle sone dine tichele ya ane yujile ne dingal kudu se be chapa ya da dingal nögidu se del ya korona ya da ane di ane minile ya nji tushin ya la so ba dine ge that samle de di le ngore chesa da nga se da le ba inza chesa da nga se le ba ne da nga se di yo lo ya chardu kan se chargudu se pa lo ya nangdu kan se nangdu se 심주 제도 지선다 nga 세디 로라 낭도 갑라 nga 세디 체셰다 갈라야 마도 볼로 파샤발라 따발라 마도 바체 그런 거니 줍되게 는거 해제를 와다 근데 나와 나신직다네 간스 두고 세는 아주 심주 제대 갑라 당은 저기 nga 지금 풍보라 되어봐다 안 체셰를 되어봐도 수 심지에도 되네기 나와 나신직 싸우기네 간라이 마도 바랑은 거니 줍되게 매봐 지금 심주지 간 직질 되봐 직질 되는 주봐 직질에 땜바던 되봐도 하고 통용으로 와 직 되봐도 땜바도 나세디 풍보다 안스 류다 셈당 풍보를 파 되봐지 통용도 지나데 뭐니 솔라 풍나서 나세디 간시여선 풍보가 보가르실 파 되제 뢰파디제스는 파 따네 데네신을 줍되게 지금 최근마도 데네 마도가 매 통고 말에 단 데네 통원이 데네 통여도 데네 안에 간라에 마도바 랑원이 두바 나와 나시디 민두스베 통야데 책으로 왔다 데네 자가 그생이 망가 쪽에다 녀마시 가사세야디 간스두스 심주시다 데네 예세는 아주 덴디게 돈에 삼다도 그생 디시야데 그생디 쉬차바래 아주 디고려
Through your meditations based on the teachings that you've received, when you're investigating your mental process, coming to recognize whether afflictions are present, identifying the afflictions that are present or that you recall from earlier, and recognize sometimes anger has arisen, or pride, or attachment, or jealousy, then not leaving it at a mere recognition of the affliction, but looking at how it arose. And we'll recognize there is likely to have been an external source, but certainly there was an internal process as well. And that process began with the thought of I. So through initially grasping at a self and I, follows thoughts of attachment, grasping at mine. So because we're grasping at this self-existent self, we then have I want. So from an I comes I want. Then attachment may arise, or jealousy may arise. Or I don't want, and one wants to repel something. And there anger arises. And from this process of arisal follows physical, verbal behavior. Recognizing this process, we come to recognize the great importance of understanding the ignorance of self-grasping, the root cause of this entire sequence. And how then does the I appear, the I that our ignorance then grasps at as existing the way that it appears? Well, it appears as if it is independent. Or to express it slightly differently, it appears as if it is not dependent. Not dependent on what? On causes, parts, or imputation by mind. And another way to express it is that the I appears as if it exists by way of its own essence, its own nature, it's self-existent. So then one investigates to see whether the way the I appears and we grasp at it, whether this is in accordance with reality or not. And we search, and we find there is no self-existent I to be found. There's no independent I. The I is very clearly, when we look, it's dependent on the aggregates and so forth. So then we come to see that in reality, our sense of self is merely imputed by mind onto the physical and mental aggregates. It does not exist in the way that it appears. The way that it appears is discordant with how it exists in reality, and therefore everything else that follows from that is clearly contrary to reality. So this is what we've been looking at over a number of weeks, and we've been looking at this through the process of dependence arising.
And in it, kissing on the Gansal Padus, Jungwin, Jebache, that denima, the Chanwa Bejaje, Chanwa Charge, Daddy Jebache, you daddy Jebache, Chanwa Beja and Jebache, Sungorwa, and in March, Yang Chando, Gadan, Ye be Chanwa, Shigla, Chunas, and then Cheshe Chanwa Chigla, and Chajin Chanwa Chilla, Cheshe Chando, Gadan, Ye Jing, and then Chadan, Chajin, Tadi in Me, Cheshe Nam, Sana, Chanwa Mini, and then Chanwa Jigwin Bada, Rangi, Cheshe, Duma Yube, Chanwa de Rangi, Cheshe Nam, Jigduya Me, Sachi, Ondusun Sundua.
Now let's continue in the text where we started last week. So I believe everyone has a handout with a retranslation, and for those who are watching on YouTube, do download the root text again, because pages 13 and 14 have been changed quite a lot. So starting from where we left off last week at the top of page 13. Let us illustrate this with the example of a rosary which has 108 beads. The one rosary, has 108 beads as its parts. The parts and the whole are different. Yet, when the parts are eliminated, a rosary cannot be found. Because the rosary is one and its parts are many, the rosary and its parts are not one and the same.
저게 삼당에도 창화세대 다 지루하다 창화세 다 창화니 숨싱아 세지 당게 여러와 민내제 창화라면 직차도 여러와 제가 창화 그런 창화제 차진차고래 창화세 제가 창화들랑 넘윤네 창화들랑 차도 가져야는 계단 예열에 세지 계단 예열 숨거로 유거와 제가 창화 찍려야 그 창도 가져야는 계단 예열에 세 제가 되네자 창화 그런 차진되지 계단 제 창도들이네 창화되게 차시 차고로와 제가 얘자 창화 세대 지시에 제가 창도라는 창화되게 차시래 제가 되네자 창화사나 창외게 창도게 차신이 보디 군이 다대 차고로와 다대로와 다인자 창화 세대 차진지 창도되게 가소대 되게 차시지 제가 다 차시 창화 지리야 창화도 가져요네 계단 예열에 해서지
A rosary, if you have a rosary before you, there's one. If you're counting them, if we counted everyone's in the room, we would have several rosaries. But if we take a single rosary, then that would be considered the whole, and the whole is comprised of parts. So the parts will include the individual beads, and rosaries mostly have 108 individual beads, so those are the parts, and the part possessor is the rosary. So the part possessor, or the whole, is the rosary, and the parts are the individual beads. So the parts and the whole, they are different. The rosary and the beads are different. So again, I was holding up his mala. I didn't bring mine, so you saw him hold up a mala. And so this rosary is one rosary. And if you single out one of the beads, that is one bead. But one couldn't say that that one bead is one rosary, or is the one rosary. One would rather be compelled to say that that one bead is one part of the whole of the rosary. So this we see explicitly in the text, next to the first bullet point. The whole of the rosary has 108 beads as its parts. The parts and the whole are different. So here, this is a first key point, that the parts, so for example, the beads, and the whole, the rosary, are different. If you're wondering the connection suddenly with the rosary and what we've been discussing, well, now we go into mental investigation, and we close our eyes and we call to mind our rosary. So it will appear to our mind, and we'll be thinking of just one single rosary. So it appears to our mind as being one. And then we ask ourselves, does that rosary exist in the way that it appears or not?
Chanwa saji du sha chosagal ba sha ba ina sha je dadi chando digi pa jik sha pa bi chu bi chasan pa bi ne gyada geba de re pa ko yu sha ba ne dendel chanwa me warwa chanwa nye mi do wa jisa ni chashe nam sana chanwa mi ni se wa di se wa da de.
What we doing here is investigating whether the way the object, the rosary, appears is how it exists in reality or not. So we know to our mind, a rosary, one, appears to us. We also know it has many parts, 108 beads, and if we move each bead looking for the whole rosary, we don't find it there. And this we see in the second part of that sentence. Yet when the parts are eliminated, a rosary cannot be found.
나도 전에 창화도 봐 채시 레리 봐 유샤바이나 나 창화디 델 매바 동바 차로 봐 제가 니네 인자 땅안주도 전에 삼단 창화세디 니네게 차시 몽부질이야 되되 바치르마도 차시디게 봐 매바 소리나 창화 매바 차로 제가 창화세디 디 차시 차상 니네게 초되게 델 차시 창화스 레도 와 제가 창화디 그런 차시를 되어 바치리도 와 제가 삼는 나라 갈리고스 나도 갈라 가나스는 마디오 바시난기도 와스 제사디 모인예술 바 심주치도 차시디 바세디도 창화를 매바 차르고도 제사 창화세디 그런 거 차시에 창도 되길래 뛰어바지 차기도 와스 제사 낭술라 마디오 바시난기도 예술라 모인예술라 창도를 뛰어바시도 와스 베게 다 삼로시 리교로 와 당스 두스친
What we will find here is that when we call to mind the rosary, and it appears to us, it appears as if it is independent. Every phenomenon appears to consciousness as being independent. But when we investigate, and now even if we do it either mentally or with our physical rosary in our hand, and we separate the beads one by one, looking for the rosary, we don't find it. What are we finding? Here's a bead, here's another one, here's another one, here's another one, held together by a cord. But nowhere are we saying, amongst any of these parts, can the whole be found. Rather, what we recognize, that when we look at the entire rosary, with all its beads and the cord, onto that, we can, our independence on all those parts, do we have a rosary? But independent of, for example, parts, no rosary can be found. So here we see a contradiction. The rosary appears to consciousness as being independent, self-existent. But when we search for the rosary, we're looking amongst all the beads, we can't find it there. But only if independent on that collection of beads can we say we have a rosary. So therefore, despite appearing as being independent, the way of existing is dependent. So therefore, again, we see appearance and reality not being in a concordance.
다데네 창화직 인바당 랑기 차시 두마 예배 창화대 랑기 차시에 남나 찍도야 메스. 제가 창화세디 랑기 차시에디게 세용도 창화대 니에메바 차르고도 근데 창화세디 창화 랑기 차시다나 찍레벨라네 찍마레스 가선 창화세디 코로나 찍레스 랑기 차시에디게 코로나 차시를 라기도 왔어. 제가 코로나 차시인자 코로나 차시데 찍마레 제가 창화세디 창화 코로나 차시에다 찍마레스 코니 가가는 요레스 가가 여바인자 창화디 랑게 차시에는 찍야 마레스.
So looking at the first point of the seven, because the rosary is one and its parts are many, the rosary and its parts are not one and the same. The rosary is one, but it has many parts. So therefore, we can come to see that the rosary and its parts are different. They are not the same.
차시 망보 여바자 망보대다 찍니디 찍레벨은 찍마르와고 가르와 제가 되네자 찍마레사 나나 차시 남산나 창화 로수 미두베 원이담 시자 랑네 타데도 메스.
That's then the first of the seven. Because the rosary is one and its parts are many, the rosary and its parts are not one and the same. So therefore they have to be different. They are not identical. They're not one. Then second, when the parts are eliminated, there is not a separate rosary. Therefore, the rosary does not exist essentially or fundamentally different from its parts.
그래서 저기 창위의 체시되기 파 세시나 매번 파바디 대신 야시바네 창화기 디안 창화 체시되기 파 매번 소셔바네 창화디 아니 동상치마도 예 창화디 매번 차르고와 매번장 창화디 랑기 체시리 뭐 타리비게 체시라 마토바 코롱원이 줍되겐지 원이데 여르베선 디민두스 가르세네 체시디게 마 데네 체시데 가나서 삼노나 나와나시 코로나 차실라 마디오바 코로나 원이 줍등에 주여바이나 차시디게 매바 쇠베네야 코로나 다가라 하고로 와스 지난 되네 인자 아니 차시디게 매바 쇠네 창화디 매바 차르고도 와스 되네 인자 창화디 랑기 차실레 모 타데바 시설레야 란신 고 랑의 차실라 마디오바 코로나 원이 로소지 민두스 타데바 민두스 시자란에 타데바 민 타데도 매세 시자란에 타데도 하메 시자스는 공무인이 술에서 우르와다
When the parts are eliminated, there's not a separate rosary. This was similar to what I mentioned a moment ago, when if the rosary exists in the way that it appears as something independent, as truly existent, as existing by way of its own essence, when all its parts are separated and spread out, that rosary should become clear. The truly existent, independent rosary should become clear. But rather, it cannot be found. So that's the meaning of the first part. When the parts are eliminated, there is not a separate rosary. Therefore, the rosary does not exist essentially or fundamentally different from its parts. So the truly existent rosary, or the way the rosary that appears to us as being truly existent, no such rosary can be found. So therefore, it cannot be independent. And it being independent, it would be different from its parts, unrelated to its parts. But it does not exist in this way.
지산 단다라 가르승고르스네 지산 창화디게 체시디게 세용도 창화디 매바 차르고래 지산 창화 로스 니금도 매반사 단다라 갈라고르스네 디니자 창화세디 코랑 체시를 떼바치리도 와서 체시를 떼대바지마 체시를 마떼바지 미도와 체시를 마떼바지 코 떼바이나 여나 체시디 매바 쇠나요 코랑 다가라 하고 그래서 지산디 하기면도 와서 코 체시를 떼는 줍대바치레스 디데 지산 체시디게 세용도 창화디 매바 차르고도 체시디게 차상 여대바이네 창화디 두스 디네장한서 두 심주치도 갑라다 창화세디 창화 코랑게 체시 멍부질파 떼바지레샤스 하고 두고 그래지라
The meaning of the second of the seven here is that the rosary that appears to us as being self-existent, when we eliminate the parts or we separate out the parts, the self-existent rosary should become ever clearer to us, because it appears to us as if it is independent of its parts. But yet we can't find it, which means it has to be dependent on its parts, despite appearing as if it is independent. And again, because if it were independent of its parts, when the parts are separated out, or what we have here, eliminated, the rosary itself, the whole, should become abundantly clear. But that's not the case. In fact, it disappears. So therefore, despite appearing as independent of its parts, the rosary is dependent on its parts.
Zada Chanwadi, Chanwa Rangi Chashile, Yangardo Maybe, Zida Rangi Chashile Loso, Chanwadi Minuse, maybe Chanwa Rangi Chashila, Woni, Partemba de Maresio. Zada Chanwa said Rangi Chashile Loso Mindu, Meva, the Rangi Chashile Dingo is. 이내 원이 땜바데 말해서 원이 땜바 말해서 차시에디게 청와랑의 차시를 띵거를 배선 랑의 차시를 띵기도 되지 제바지도 랑의 차시에 이메 받쳐 세제바는 청와메 받쳐 제자 청와서야 랑의 차시를 뛰니 두고도 랑의 차시를 뛰고도 돼 안에 간스 뛰고서 원이 땜바 말해서 원이 땜바데 말해서 창화들랑 차실에 띵거를 되는 원이 땜바 말해서 라신이 주비 땜바데 말해서
The third one, because the rosary does not exist separately from its parts, an inherently existent rosary does not depend upon its parts. So here, as we've established, there is a relationship of dependency, but that the rosary itself, that depends upon its parts, it cannot be inherently existent, nor can the dependency itself be inherently existent. We'll express that differently. Let's see here. The rosary does not inherently depend upon its parts.
나 차시 창위 차시되게 안에 출라랑게 원이 땜바 아마인스 오다 니가 마인스 지사다 차시되게 창화를 띵거되는 원이 땜바데 말했어.
Similarly with the fourth, nor do inherently existent parts depend upon the rosary. So here too, there is a relationship of dependency, but the parts aren't inherently existent, and nor is the dependency inherently existent.
다 창화당 창도기 내려와 창화세당 창도되게 원이 땜바 민스들 창화들라 창도 가져서 가단지 요를 라고를 이내 요를 때 이내 원이 요 말했어. 갈래 맞도바랑 원이 두바도 요 말했어. 창화 원이 창위 차시되게 창화를 창화 차시 가져요래서는 가단지 요래서로 가단지 보대 갈래 맞도바랑 원이 두도지 요래서는 되네죠 말했어. 그 유아줘야 요래 차야 요래 신의 되는 저 유되게 책으로.
And fifthly, also the rosary does not possess inherently existent beads. So again, the rosary so possesses or belongs to, it's often translated as belongs to. So there is this relationship, but there is no part, there is no inherent existence found anywhere in the relationship. Even that the possession or the belonging is not inherently existent.
대신 더 체외 입 랑기 계셔 제 임베 체외 입 창화 means 다 창외의 입 되게나 창화의 계셔를 마도 창화 말해서.
And sixth, similarly, since the shape of the rosary is one of its qualities, the shape of the rosary is not the rosary. So the rosary has a shape, but that shape is not the rosary.
다 창도다 창다 초방 창화 간라의 때에 답이 시인비 창화 미스 다 창화의 창외의 창화를 다 창도되다 안델리아 창화 기회의 구부구버져 창도 창 타바지어 봐 타바 디수 초바디야 델라 때에 창화 따마 디소야 창화 말해서 그래서 창도를 다 창다디기야 초바디야 창화 레베스 창화 말해서
And seventh, also the collection of the beads and the string is the basis in dependence upon which the rosary is imputed. Therefore, it is not the rosary. So here we have the collection or the aggregation of the parts. This is the basis in dependence upon which rosary is imputed or labeled or designated. So therefore, it is not an inherently existent rosary.
대대로 zen나 창화 타뒤 강도야 니도 메스 대대로 zen나 대대로에게 대대로 zen나 창화 타뒤 강도야 니도 메스.
If it is sought in this way, a rosary is unfindable as any of the seven extremes.
나단 너나랑 두세 창화스 바두 제바체디가나 나 창외 창도디양 창화 말에 안에 창외 촉바디양 창화 말에 안 창화 고란다 찍다 타디야 가야 말에서 두 심지도 다 타메 타주는 창화서데 간시리에서는 Chenwe takwa del pa, chengdo te pa gyuche, pa gyuchen dine kogo ti tsoba del pa, del ya, dini tsoba del dine, chengwa si pa, lui pa, da chi res, da le yo pa res yo re. Chenwe takwa del pa gyuche, kogo chek ruwa. Chezan chengdo de yang chengwa ma re, chen takwa da di chezang tsoba de yang chengwa ma re. An tami tazu chengwa de gari le, dini ki tsoba del pa, lui pa, chengwa si pa, lui da pa zam yo pa res ya.
Looking at the individual parts of the rosary, which will be any single of those 108 beads, or any collection of those 108 beads, none of them are the rosary, nor the string that holds it together. That neither is the rosary. And in fact, the aggregation themselves are not the rosary. Rather, on that aggregation, mind imputes rosary. That's the only way that there is a rosary, is independent on imputation by mind onto its basis, the aggregation of the parts.
Ani changwa se ding anzu lo char de ne motor ro chi sa ro motor ro chi pe na anzu du chi ne motor se ji sam ta de anzu motor se sam ta de motor kholo de motor sang ma ro ba motor nang ki engine de motor sang ma ro ba che sa da anzu motor se de lo pa cha de khorong lo su che go ine da anzu du chi de motor kholo di motor se de motor ki cha she de da motor ni de ta de de ro ba ine da anzu nang yo de motor is na de motor ke chashi na jeme duen korong kan la ma rang mun de ben nang go re na wa na xin ting a du xin de xia xie da na wa na xin ji motor du ye sen be zai ji da ji chi mi chi de di motor colores di motor ma de colores pa xia di motor ki ane go re sen se ko pa xia di motor na no ki engine de res pa xia di motor na de so gu bie de res pa xia du sen re xiang jia la san re ji pa se xia ben di motor de me ma cha ru go ro motor me re 제산다는 모터 매반자다 모터를 간이 두신 차시 차상 뒤 초어지 초는 domnen del야 초발에 del라 되네 아니 모터스 민다지 여바리 모터세디 차시 딜 오 타디도 매래다 모터세디 빈가는 저기 모터게 차시 차상 용수 쪽바 del파 되네 del은 오지 벌마다 del에 로수 모터세디 제는 예 매바로 제상 모터 세야 돼 모터게 차시 초바 차상 되는 오직마도 되는 오 로스지 메로다 그래서 차시디 파세는 오 모터 예미도아 매반자 모터 세야디 모터기 괴기 혹은 튕긴 차상 차시 용수 소바디 파 차상 좀 살제 좀 베게 된 모터 스타고 제상 모터 세야디 디 차시 초바 되는 오 로스요 말다 대고 오 로스요나 차시디 파파파 세나 모터 하고 그래 딜 하야미도 와세 This that motor loss yo martine motor down motor chashi di jig rebesin jig mare khonsu ko taje bar chashi da motor se da motor kholo jig marwa jesa motor da motor ge go di jig marwa jesa motor chashi de da motor ni jig rebesin jig mare motor se kha ga re an chashi se ko re chashi ka ga cha gro wa mo jig re je 모터게 차시에 초바데 차시 차상 덤 초되게 되다 모터니디 모지리스 마도 모록수요 말에 이상 아주 낭돌라 차시를 떼바며 바고 뭐샬라 마 차시를 마도 뭐 권이 주바시 능거로 봐 지금 심주제도 모터세 차시에 먹고 초바들 초바를 떼바는 마도 될 마도 비기 모터시 예미도 와서
Our text uses the illustration of a rosary. You have read elsewhere the traditional illustration of a cart or a chariot, but let's take something we're more familiar with, and that is a car. So if just by mentioning the word car, probably for all of you, an image appears to mind of your car. But what appears to your mind is not any of the individual parts of the car. When you hear the word car, you don't think of engine or door or wheel. You think of the whole car. So there is a difference between the car and its parts. Likewise, so despite the car appearing as inherently existent, when we divide it up into its parts, we see that the parts are not the car, because if we spread out all the parts, after taking away just some of the key components, we will no longer have something left that we can call a car. So therefore, the car and the parts are different, but when you put together all those parts in a particular way, in the suitable, appropriate manner, then that aggregation of parts of a car is suitable to be called a car, suitable to have the label, to be labeled or imputed as car. So what we see here is firstly that the whole and the parts are different, and now secondly though, that the whole and the parts, when aggregated, being suitable to be labeled as the whole, as the car, shows they are of one essence, but they are also different. Just to make sure the conclusion was clear, the parts and the whole are different, but they are of one essence.
모자게 콜로다 지 차셰 차상 내 뛰네 지게 다바치 다셰비기 뛰네 줍줍레스 별로래 차익민도와 성문민도와 대성민도와 모자라빈도 그런 지 도도래 지 롤바치 차르디고 마도 성민도와 당한 줄도 심주 제제 모자셋파 지 차셰 망부 지 잘라 망부 지 초아지 데니실 초네 주고요 받아 삼다도 지 삼다도 당한 두 하고 당한 남유래 모자 라면도 롤이야 차지 가는 곳은 모자세디 차시에 망보지 둠네 뒤지 초네 데니게 초발에 데니 줍디게 지마도 이 데니 줍디게 지레 삼베그 롤이야 지 차투고 거다 띵아주 지금도 모자 라면도 모자게 콜로다 엔진다 데니 마 차시 망보지 뒤네 초바지레 삼금민도 하면서래 지가선 도도 모자세지 그런 도도라지 된디요 마도 씁니다 지상한 두시 심주제데 나는 가는줄이야 모자세 삼노 코요데네 삼르야 가르치고 오서는 모자세디 차시에 망보지는 뒤시 초제 될야 따비게 따네 여바시리아 세베게 데니줄을 차르고 고고걸 당하줄래 차고 모자세디 제가 모자세디 로 차요나 강라에 마디오바 그런 줍딩엔지도 요 말에 진짜 차시에 망보 뒤는 초비 초과지를 뛰네 파라 뢰파 따바점이 여바시리 세베게 다 삼로도 콜투고 거라는데 남긴 모자세디 롤야 삼땅이 고용되네 모자 되네시야 삼백에 고 야롤야 차고 거 딜롤 차야 딩아 주기 모자 삼땅 심리 안에 야도 모자세디 차시 되네 딩기도 디스면 모자 차기면 왔으면 두 진에 야네 고 차시를 떼나데 삼땅야다 마템반에 차시되게 파파바 되시 제바다 콜로다 파지 사상 예와 제바네 모자 니기미도 제사 모자세디 랑기 차시에 망부 초바들 딴 대당 모직발마도 델라마되버지 민도와선배 삼내 야네 야도 땅에 가지고 녀바녀바는 마오바나 네 모타스 고연들 남사 어디 차시에 망부 뒤에 초바들 파 따바zam이 두비지 레 세베스 삼로들 롤이야 차투가지 고고를 당한줄래
When I say the word rosary, a rosary appears to your mind. Or I say the word car appears to your mind. And how it appears is together with all its parts. So if I say, think of your car appears together with all its parts. But how it appears to our mind is as an inherently existent car, as a whole. It appears as if it is independent. Because how it does not appear to us is as an aggregation of parts. It rather appears as a whole. being independent of parts, not requiring those parts. It appears as a whole. Now, because of our discussion, you will be recognizing that the car that appears to my mind is an aggregation of parts. But this is an intentional thought, a separate thought. The way the car spontaneously appears to us is as a whole that is independent, self-existent, not requiring parts. But because we know the car well, on reflection, we immediately recognize, of course, it's an aggregation of parts, and if particular parts are missing, it couldn't be called the car. So what we need to recognize is the sequence, because the sequence is quite easy to understand. It appears to us as a whole. We remind ourselves it's actually an aggregation of parts, and it's an aggregation of particular parts in a particular way that then makes it a suitable basis to be imputed by mind as a car, or labeled by mind as a car. So going through that sequence right now, it should be abundantly clear. It's not difficult. But nevertheless, every other object of thought appears to us as independent, as a whole, not requiring parts or imputation or causes. But by engaging in this reflection again and again and again, both in meditation as well as when we're going about our daily life, every object of thought appears as if it is independent, but it is dependent on causes, parts, and imputation. And as we remind ourselves of this again and again, we'll start to become more habituated to this way of thinking. And thereafter, things that we see, or words that we hear, sounds that we hear, taste, etc., and things we are just thinking about, we'll start to recognize that how it appears to us is not how it exists in reality. So by going through this reflection again and again, we'll gain ever stronger familiarity with how phenomena exist in reality.
지상 모자 세대 고용화다 암초 고화다 모자 세 미게 통용화다 람사 강라에 그서 풍부 그 차시 망보치를 되네 줍지 되네 바로에 따바 잠지래야 삼비 삼로들 되네게 삼는 샤르토바네 람사 되네 삼주 코로나도 그 코르투고 여베나 되네 코로나도 아 저래 모자데 강라에 마도 봐 코로나 원이 주바제 삼비 삼로디 되네게 삼나에 삼로디 슈충주고 다가 슈충주고 디니디 가서 젠 차실을 망보치를 되네 줍디버지야 삼비게 삼레요도 강라에 마도 랑원이 줍디버야 삼비 삼릉이디 가다로와 지산 되네 줍디레 삼비 삼로디까지 슈처 누버처나 강라에 마도 랑원이 줍바레 삼비 삼로디 누버충슈 충슈주고 다 지산 모자세 삼 다당아서 모자세 삼 코여도가라 직 도도르 직 비슷하여 차도마도 차시 코를 망보치를 되는 줍디버레 삼비게 삼로지 코를 두고는도와 지산 되네게 되는 줍디버지레 삼비 삼 코여도 아니 강라에 마도 코롱원이 도도 지에되되 나도바나 다가라 요래 삼비 삼로디 마슈 충주고 그러다.
Because we've been speaking about the car a little bit now. When you go out later and you see your car, or maybe even tomorrow someone refers to a car, then you can be quite aware that it may appear to us as being a whole, as if it doesn't appear to us as being an aggregation of parts upon which mind imputes the label car. It appears as a whole. But when we keep reminding ourselves, that's not how it exists. It is an aggregation of parts, a particular aggregation of parts, upon which mind then can impute or label the term car. As we remind ourselves of this again and again, and move to subtler objects, not just what we see, but also what we hear and so forth, then our grasping at things existing in the way they appear as being independent, of not requiring causes to come about, or parts, or imputation, that grasping weakens.
당연히 이 청와를 잘 해야 돼, 모델을 잘 해야 돼. 이게 비되는 시고래. 그래서 청와 생각도 미기 통화해야 돼. 모델 미기 통화해 듬대로. 지금 비고니셔. 디나신 삼당하디 두스나야디 된랑어 저기 나가 삼다야. 그래서 아주 쉬버다. 나가 삼다야. 지금 디네 자다 나세야디 비디나이 청와 세야디 청유 코랑 차시에 망보실을 뛴주 봐. 모자시도 모자게 세세 망보질을 뛰네 봐 줍죠 봐 지레마도 강한 차실을 마되비게 모자시 민도아스 디나신 다 삼로 모자스 삼로 코가 되네 모자 세세 망보질을 뛰네 줍디게 지레 아 선배 삼로 코와 나신 나저 나 세다 돈달라 가서 바 조디레 나라 삼당 제가 나세 삼당 나세 삼당 나세야디 차시에 망보질이야 봐 뛰네랑 풍부하다 되니게 tuyni pa lue pa taba zin drupti bachiri a sambe deni shiri sambe lo le ya char tu bachi ko gore deni charwa ina nga se sam amjo gowa da nga sam kowa namsa nga se di rangi phungbo da nam chi jenchi le tuyni pa lue taba zin drupti bachiri a sambe sam lo kowa ina ane nga se di gang la yama de rang mun drupti ke di druba na wa na shin da ga re sambe sam lo de shuk chung du gore.
The text uses the illustration of a rosary. The traditional illustration is a cart. Tonight, or rather, also spoke about a car. These objects are specifically chosen as illustrations because they are objects of sight that we all know, we're all familiar with, and that it's easy to come to understand how they, despite appearing as a whole or as one, they actually are dependent on parts and imputation by mind. But the primary purpose of utilizing these illustrations is, through getting familiar with the technique, to apply it to the I, to the self. This is of great importance. The process is the same. So we start with a straightforward illustration, such as the rosary or the car, but then we need to apply it to what really matters, is this our I, or our sense of self. We need to first recognize how our I appears, which is as independent. Well, in this context, we can say as a whole or as one, which means it doesn't require parts, imputation, causes. We've done this reflection many times, so you're familiar with the steps. But by continuing again and again to hear these teachings on this topic, and to engage in the meditations repeatedly, never being able to find this I, this truly existent I, we'll gain confidence that what we're hearing and what we're understanding on an analytical level really is true, that the I does not exist in the way that it appears. And then, through gaining familiarity and engaging in this meditation a lot and keeping it in mind between meditation sessions, when someone calls out our name, that will remind us that this name is merely an imputation onto the collection of aggregates. Similarly, when we think of ourselves, I need to do this, I need to say that, I need to arrange these things, there's an I at the thought of this. And we can, through habituation, we will start to relate to ourselves as not existing in the way that we appear. And similarly, when the I isn't manifestly, or obviously rather, isn't obviously at the center of a thought process, as we become more skilled, we come to recognize how the I still is the driving force, the sense of I, and from that, mine and attachment and anger and so forth follows. And we'll keep reminding ourselves that I do not exist in the way that I appear. And in this way, our grasping at our sense of self will weaken.
Nga se samdang yu, chisa nga se di shen chi le dui ne pa lu taba tsam chi ma do na wa na xe rang ngui ni zhuba ji yo ma re sempe ki ta samlo di du chi samdang yu, samlo di nga na wa na yu ba sempe samlo shuk chung zhubo re. Di shuk chung zhuba sempe rang je zinge samlo se di se wa rang je da si samlo shuk chung zhubo re ba. Rang zu le rang je zinge samlo de ka tse shuk che na de la tene dua cha ge le la wa, kong zhuo ge le la wa, cha do ge le la wa yung go re ba. 지자 거스네 델레테네 지자 당 랑제징이 삼로 숙침부 슈주변에 현지 되었지 내버려지나 남상 콩랑 쳐셔다 지그 랑제징 삼로 숙주버에 미치게 뛰어가를 일단 남상 빼슈 가셔셔라 되는 거로봐 지자 랑제징이까지 숙체나 콩로다 녀모바지에 될라 용거래 지자 랑제징이 숙삼로데 셔라 숙제라 같이 충화여변에 콩로나에他人话瞧，对下界对是他人话，看着界他人话，别呢，让这什么修起来没呢？米几个对进牛包来呗呢？哎，我们什么时候去不下去？可能给我们了，真的是让这这什么修起来呢？说是的牛毛界这个他人住过，牛毛界用住过，现在的那啥，让这些什么的修起来的，现在俺就。让其实说的俺说那样的刚来嘛，让我们这边那完了有的身边三六的俺说的修全部有了的，现在的那个俺说心就节节现在碰碰啊不刚着绿怕电的大把嘛的刚来嘛对吧？让我们这没什么，俺说什么的俺现在就碰碰怕电的大把咱们这人啊身边什么大的，让其实什么的修全做过了，就是让其实什么修全做完，那俺说有么节的修全做，都今年俺都今让。디네기 따바 쯤이래 지다 강라에 마도바 다랑원에 두바도 요마레 세베 삼로디 가지 슈체로바나다 랑제징기다 삼로딩 요바스 다zen 마릭 바세디 마슈 춘슈 다데 탑람디디 차고 지자다 탑람 조 디레 지상한저 자와 딜파 기시월 다디 지자디 뜨스 갈레 하고 차고 여러바다 고 하고라 차고로바
Going through the text as we've done briefly tonight, and also perhaps some other parts, it can sometimes appear a little bit difficult, and perhaps sometimes even intellectual and not relevant. But it's important to understand the relevancy, because this will encourage us to strive to understand the topic and apply the topic. So firstly, we need to recognize how the self appears and then search it out, as we've heard many times. And by doing this, through the techniques we've been hearing tonight and previously, we'll come to recognize that the I does not exist in the way that it appears. It is not independent. It is not a whole that is independent of parts and causes and imputation. And this, as we've heard many times, serves to weaken our self-grasping. But another way that this can be expressed is as we come to recognize that the I doesn't exist in the way that it appears, the self doesn't exist in the way that it appears, our self-cherishing weakens. And it's really the strength of our self-cherishing that leads to the rapid and strong arisal of afflictions. Our self-cherishing at times is very strong, at other times is not as strong. And it's at those times when our self-cherishing mind is of greater than usual strength, we are more irritable. We get angry easier. Our desire, our attachment overwhelms us more. At other times, when our self-cherishing is weaker, and our other cherishing mind is more dominant, we can easily let things go. Our mind is more spacious and calm. We don't grasp as strongly. So when one has meditated repeatedly over a sustained period, and not just meditated, integrated this way of thinking into one's daily life, one's self-grasping will weaken. Or to express it differently, our self-cherishing will weaken. Because through meditating a lot, we'll wonder, what am I cherishing so? It doesn't exist in the way that it appears. What am I grasping at so strongly? It doesn't exist in the way that it appears. And thereby, with our mind relaxing, not taking ourself and events nearly as seriously, the strength and frequency of our afflictions will be greatly transformed. So this is the purpose of why we're looking at this entire text, why we're looking at this particular outline and all the others. This is the purpose of what we are doing here.
데네 딜리 되는 아주 강한 용다지체 제사당 저기 semba sangbo da andi rang ji jing ge dok cho da chue tham je kan de sin da nga se kang la de ba me rang ngwen tu ba zaw ge me nga se de phumbo dan rang sem da phumbo le de pa ta ba zhe yo re san be ge de ne dok be ge lo de la de ne nga ce ge da ding wen ni su ge nga se wen ni su tong ge lo de cha go ding wo lo ma no wa cha de ce san de la de ne an ma 先里也判把的讲把的这位上把的安的你用过了吧就是的你跟上了呀判别给安的上了的给安的都是主播而且当然是上主他的用过的些这在我的了让接近上了的第一多就让心把东北有多不落就是让接上把的了的牛毛把的给的越给让现在越给的就是让第一多就东北有多不落的电信这我中有多不落的了的呢 然后人一个嘞，判别的落的结用啊，就咱个早定义的土地的，现在定义了的那个就落上岸的怕人把钱离过来些。就咱东北有多把的，定金之后就比落地的，得了的呢，先来讲把的，再话的，先来判别的落上辈的几个了吧，地界把了的呢，让先一个来判别的一个了吧。 然后这些上班的了的呢，工作对家外家是的，地基有的，俺的了的让些一个了内把的利用了吧，就是在东海的用的利用了吧，就像早晚用啥的，土色的定义的利用了些。
As has been said many times, it's from our ignorance of self-grasping that all our other afflictions, such as attachment and anger, follow. From grasping at a self and I follows attachment, clinging to things as mine. So another way to express this, instead of saying the ignorance of self-grasping, one can say the self-cherishing mind. It's a self-cherishing mind that wants things to go our way, how we want things to go, and repels, pushes things away. So that perhaps is easier to relate to, that it's from cherishing ourselves that we want things to go our way, we want to protect our self. But as we come to recognize that the self that we cherish so doesn't exist in this way at all, that cherishing of this non-existent self, this independent self, weakens. And our wisdom that is in accordance with reality, that relates to the self in an unmistaken way, recognizing that the self is, that exists is a dependent arising, causes, parts, and imputation. This mind then, being a mind of wisdom, being a mind that is in accordance with reality, is an open and spacious mind. And from such a mind, love and compassion for others readily arise. In fact, the wisdom realizing emptiness and the wisdom realizing dependence arising, these are powerful causes that lead to the arisal of virtuous minds.
chi ngo bo le tin nga zo phan yo ya dia za wa sam le tin yo go re che le sem la chi ngo bo le tin nga zo le phan yo yong gu lo wa dia za wa sam le tin yo go re che le za wa sam le ko za yu pa sim ju ji ba chi de za wa sam le tin yo go re ta ga ne yong go re se de nga zo ne rik ti khar yo re se ne duk je da ji ga chang sa da ben duk je sa la so ba da ni duk ru da an ji chön je rik ti ki 아니 가지고 누구로 써야 돼. 이러와 천체. 디소 가르래네 셈 자와섬네 가르리고 해야 돼. 천체 써야 돼. 당보 써야 돼. 미치기 삼로시 다 쓰고로 봐. 삼로시 콜제. 그 삼바제. 편이 밀내래 또야래 점야래. 탑럼 가르치는 가는 쓰고도 셈비가 삼다제. 되니까 제조 되네서 디소에 두고도 되네 뒤쪽 두고 셈비. 군노 삼로다 삼로 디토네 제조 막보루 쓰여지네. 아니 쓰여지네 디기 천차서 디기 파 밀로 써야다 되네 뇌바 먹으리고 와. 디나시 밀야 dukta dine ki cheje nöbe kiye ki tondalia samlo taje dijen del nö tu se dijen del nö so dine nöbe kiye den dine jene ko tik su gora tanga 저게 잘라도 선 빼네 dine ki nö ri de de wa de dus chene ko nö ri dine ki dine chiung obo je de la dine ngasuli 빼네 koryu tigili na 빼네 빼 소수기 지기 대항함 돈이 빼줘 대항 슈 챔베 돈에 거유를 녀만 삼마다제 지금 막보지 누와 땅 15지 15지 대저도 갑라 군롱게 되네게 삼노다 되네 돈이 막고 써요도 되네 두와다 되네게 지기 돈에 아니 지기 제저 돈에 녀 막고 거유 녀 막고 강아 막고 리거와 디차사도 전에 심주 제반 디송한 저기 자외 삼 군롱지 미지 군롱지게 디 돈에 아니 다마라 쇠발에 되네 가서 강아제 지 릭직리 거로바다 지금의 베릭티 디로와
The outset of tonight's class, I mentioned that benefit and harm comes to us from both the material world as well as our way of thinking. And if you think about it a little, it becomes quite clear that material phenomena that can cause either benefit or harm, that material phenomena also comes about in dependence on the mind. So in both streams of benefit and harm, either from the material world or the mental world, it's really the mental world that's primary. It's at the heart of both. For example, if we take some material phenomena that cause harm, we can think, say, of drugs or weapons. So here, the people who manufacture and sell drugs, as well as those who design and manufacture and sell weaponry, they're utilizing their profound human intelligence to create and sell and distribute these things that only bring harm. Similarly, if we look at the situation in the world in terms of environmental destruction, this isn't causeless. And those causes weren't from the natural environment. They were man-made. Human intelligence with a desire, so that affliction of attachment for ever greater profit and power and influence, led to the willful destruction of our environment. So these few illustrations of illegal drugs and weapons and the environmental catastrophe that the world is facing are easy to understand how this material situation that brings such harm has also come about in dependence on ways of thinking.
펜베리지 삼다베나 가서 모자 세다 면 세다 데니기 지게 넘주 세다 아니 지게 신도리다 데니기 망고 지가서 펜 치유무비 토네가서 펜지 망고 저봐 지소자 자외 셈나 데네 용고봐 벤당보 군로지 미치기 삼나다 모자 데니시 데니시 소고도 세베 삼다 데니기 삼노 군로지 캐 삼노다 디 삼노 디 땅에 토네 아니 코 베제 제제 넘주 세다 모자 세다 디소에도 가서 파수 줘야기 베지 땅에 빼 판도 침부여야다 아니 지기다데 데네기 나제 세야리아 지기 가네스체네 세우고도 샤쇠지야다 데네 면주에 가네시고도 면가네 세우고 데네 삼노다네 제조 데네시네 코 제바제 데네지네 디 나제 세두 데네시 나제 세두 데네게 삼노다데 제바제제 디 면주 세용으로와 진 나제 세두고로와 제사 칼라 직대 데네로와 제사 데네데 지차사 자위 군농한테 삼로시고 녀로도와 삼로지래 되는 용도와 제가 디네자 모자세다 메릭세다 넘주릭세다 더 컴퓨터 릭세 취재절에 찾아 당보 삼로되는 리그로와 디 찾아 판도 치부디 찾아 자위 셈을 되는 용도와 제가 아주 삼단의 세우시고 하고 돼야지도 하죠.
In the same way, material phenomena that bring good and benefit in the world, these material phenomena also come about in dependence on human intelligence. For example, if we think of the developments in terms of medicinal treatment, forms of transport, the homes we live in, food production, all of these and many other, and technology in the world that brings human benefit has all come about in dependence on the utilization of human intelligence to design and to develop and to manufacture and to distribute and to sell. So we see here too, the material phenomena that bring benefit also comes about in dependence on a way of thinking.
안데네 자당 주기 덴티게 자외 삼로드네 리고래 제산 다장한주 삼로델이야 무인이 수된 튠바 무인이 수는 튠바지 삼로 실레베나 삼로 다베네 델레디는 가지고 캐펜 두게 다 판도인 거죠 무인이 수된 메튠바지 삼로 치데 델레디네 가지고야 강아제 라시니까 강아레야 딜리티고로 베나 저기 인제합 펜신 투부게다 마제디 가르치는 결과를 가능스 리고라서 심주어 제도 미망 돈에 마제디 람살리고 말와 또 수수 심지에도 개합니래 본부 거시게 본부 첨부니여로 와다 코로나니 삼로 디마튠 바치 차주도 가다 차도 되네게 마튠 바드 삼로 직전에 되는 가서 삼로 슈체셔도 되네 펜션업이 개체고로 와 인디 그마제디 차고로 와 인디 나신 베네 개합 교보지네 다디 개합 교보들라 가르고 고서나 코로나에 변조 고고로 콘솔에 강아세 디기 고고로 콘솔 강아세데 세야 디기 두고고로 와 이내야 다 개합션다 제 본보지기 권이 본보디 삼로데 마튠디 아니디 무인이 수디 마디디 파쇼들야 고야디 파쇼 무인이 수디 개합 교보들 가르고 고선 콜로 로보 고고로 코 판도 고고로 와 지산 디기 독초 삼로데네 강존델야 그런게 따와 삼로 마틴 바차도 아니 가르치고서는 델야 로봇이기요 말에 데데 가톰 제고래 세디 파직 가톰 제도 스카가데도 강아 몽부스티요 지가선 파쇼데다 무인에서 미든바 삼로 출래서 bom부들레로 파쇼게 무인에서 춤바데 무인에서 가르선 콘솔라 강아 세고고에 수급고고 로봇고고로 와 지산 수쇼델라 삼로데 디무인에서 미든바 아니 가르려서 콜로 로봇이기요 말고 가톰 제고래서 삼로 레요도 이 토네 아니 로바체야 가dom제도 페니 강아지 망볼레 용으로와 아니 바지 강아지 망볼레도 한 바저데 가솔 디 가솔 기합디 가솔 강아지 그래서 야 델레 견제제야다 데넬레야 견제제나 가그마로야 마가와시 셈 강아리고로 지선도 진리도 조조 디스 차사 셈레데네 고르스 튠미팅 토네 레용도 셈레데 레용도와데 지상아도 시즌 돼서 락바라바 된가 저기 지가 하고 투야지 자기도 와 지사 데네자 데네기도 제 삼다에도 되는 거 저기 다센시아다 라치 삼로세야데 디솔티네 안가저 강아 용다디바 락바라바나야 두수 삼당이 등이 집에네 또 차차때 하고 투야지 세세세 차야지 용고로 와데
In brief, one can say that when one's way of thinking is in accordance with reality, benefit will follow for oneself and others. When one's way of thinking is not in accordance with reality, harm will follow for oneself and others. So if we take an illustration, one of, say, warfare between nations, so I'd imagine that there's not many situations where wars were started because the population as a whole decided this is what had to happen. Rather, they would have been, perhaps one could say, manipulated. Another way to express it would be encouraged by their leaders. Their leaders, the two at the top of each nation, for their own reasoning, they would have wanted the conflict. I'd imagine that the general population, the ones who have to fight and die, this isn't their first choice, but rather those who have power and influence. This is their desire. And why so? Well, of course, it comes from a way of thinking. And they will see opportunity through invading another country. And rather than thinking, how best can I act in a way to bring benefit to those who are weaker than me, they think, how can I dominate them? How can I exploit them? And with such a motivation, they will intentionally set out to harm. And from this, happiness and peace never follows. By its very nature, conflict does not lead to contentment. Only ever more misery and pain follows. And at the start of this process was someone who was overwhelmed by their self-cherishing mind, their own self-interest. And it was that cause, combined with the causes of their power and their influence, led them to act in a way that brought about tremendous pain and misery to others. So we can take that as an illustration, and whilst we don't have the power or influence to start or stop warfare, we do, as one person, have the opportunity to transform our own mind, and thereby have that as a cause to bring benefit to all those that we interact with. This we can do. And in this way, we are eradicating or weakening and eventually eradicating what otherwise in another lifetime can, a way of thinking, an afflicted mind, the self-cherishing mind, can lead to so much pain and suffering.
잠제 삼당고도 제가 잠제 지역에나 현리아 체외 삼바기 말에 체외 삼바마게나 안샬려 봐 용말 제가 콜육다이나라 마펀주 마후게나라 데네지기 가리토이나 고하다이나라 데네게 강아디 아주 강아 마보지 망체제 지용업에 돈에 되는 강아리아에 저 망체는 아주 소가지기 미기 쇠되게 강아 차기도 제가 미기 쇠되게 강아디 아주 미세 투여시레스 제가 미세 투여의 가로고스는 잠재 삼당고 제가 잠재 삼당배는 되는 강아 마보지 세 투구도 제가 당한테 잠재 삼당의 계침부시를 샤스는 경험지게다 또 이제 잠재 점례날이야 잠재 빼야다 잠재게 냠는 제고도 세야지 다 여름치기다 저게 네 시고시게 두
When we listen to His Holiness's teachings, we often hear him encourage people to strive to develop a good heart, to develop loving kindness within themselves and their communities and those they have influence over. And he encourages those, whether they are of religious traditions or of no formal religious tradition. And he does so because, to the extent that there are more tender hearts in this world, there'll be less aggression and less conflict. To the extent that people become loving and kind towards others, not just their immediate circle, but strangers too, to that extent they'll utilize their human intelligence and skills and talents not to develop forms of harm, but to benefit each other, to bring harmony between peoples. So His Holiness encourages us to develop a good heart and to become kinder people for this reason. So thank you. We'll conclude here for tonight and then continue from the same place tomorrow.